Sons of Odin. A Berserker's Testament. The Epic of Norse Warriors and Rage Incarnate. Part 1, Blood and Fury. My name is Bjorn Ironside, though most men know me only as the Ravager or Death's Herald. I am 67 winters old, and my body bears the scars of 45 years of continuous warfare. My left eye is gone, taken by a Saxon spear at the siege of Trelleborg. My right arm is smaller than my left, a wound from a Frank sword that never healed properly. Yet I have killed more men with this scarred limb than most warriors kill in their entire lives. My beard, once the color of flame, is now the color of ash mixed with blood that has never quite washed away. I am a berserker. This word carries weight that those who have not witnessed true berserkers can never fully comprehend. We are not simply warriors. We are something other, something that exists between the world of men and the world of the gods. When the battle rage takes us, we become instruments of pure destruction, vessels through which the fury of Odin himself flows into the mortal realm. But before I tell you of the rage, before I tell you of the battles and the blood and the glory, I must tell you how a boy becomes a berserker. Because that transformation is not something that happens through training alone. It requires something deeper. It requires a connection to forces that most men will never understand. I was born in the year that the Christian monks called 953 in the settlement of Kattegat on the coast off what is now called Denmark. My father was Eric the Red, not to be confused with the later explorer who discovered Greenland, but a man who earned his name through his ability to inspire blood rage in his enemies. My mother was Sigrid, a Sami woman with strange eyes that seemed to see into other worlds. Their union was forbidden by many. The Sami were considered outsiders, people with connections to magic and the old ways. But my father loved her fiercely, and he cared not for the opinions of others. I was my parents' only child, and from the moment of my birth, there were signs that I was different. The Volva, the seeress, who attended my mother's birthing looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. She told my parents that I was marked by Odin himself, that the All-Father had placed his hand upon me before I even drew breath. She said that I would become either the greatest warrior of my generation or the greatest curse upon it. There would be no middle path for me. My childhood was spent in Kattegat, a settlement that was less a town and more a loose collection of longhouses and docks where Viking ships were built and prepared for raiding. From my earliest memories, I was surrounded by warriors, men who had sailed across the sea, who had fought in distant lands, who bore the marks of their battles with pride. My father encouraged me to observe them, to learn from them, to understand that the life of a warrior was not something pursued for glory or wealth, but something that was woven into the very fabric of Norse existence. When I was 7 years old, my father took me to my first raid. This was unusual. Most children did not participate in raids until they were at least teenagers. But my father believed that early exposure was necessary to truly understand what it meant to be a warrior. We sailed in a ship called the Ravenous Claw, a beautiful vessel with a dragon-head prow that seemed to cut through the water like a living thing. Our target was a monastery on the coast of what is now England, a place called Lindisfarne. The monks had accumulated great wealth through centuries of prayer and pilgrimage, and they had made the mistake of refusing to pay tribute to Viking raiders. My father decided that this insult required correction. I remember the screaming. I remember the smoke. I remember the way the monks looked at us with a mixture of fear and incomprehension, as if they could not understand that their God had not protected them. I was 7 years old, and I should have been traumatized. I should have had nightmares. Isolde have wept for the dead. Instead, I felt something awaken inside me. I felt a thrilling energy, a sense of rightness, as if I was finally doing what I was meant to do. While other children might have been horrified by violence, I was exhilarated by it. My father watched me with knowing eyes, and he said simply, "The rage lives in you, boy. That is good. That is very good." Part 2, The Awakening of Fury. The years between my childhood and my adolescence were years of increasing intensity. My father trained me relentlessly, not just in the use of weapons, but in the philosophy of the berserker. Had taught me that the rage was not something to be ashamed of or to resist. Instead, it was something to be cultivated, to be understood, to be channeled into purposeful destruction. Other boys my age were learning farming, learning to manage livestock, learning the practical skills needed to survive in a Norse settlement. I was learning something different. I was learning to enter altered states of consciousness. I was learning to push my body beyond its normal limits. I was learning to harness the fury that burned inside me and direct it toward my enemies. My father took me to meet other berserkers, men who had dedicated their lives to perfecting the art of controlled rage. These were terrifying men. Some of them had scars so extensive that it seemed impossible they had survived. They had survived. Others bore marks of the madness that sometimes accompanied the berserker gift: a wildness in the eyes, a tendency to speak in tongues, an inability to remain still for more than a few moments. One of these men, a berserker named Ragnar Bloodaxe, became my mentor. Ragnar was 60 years old when I met him, and he had been a berserker for 50 of those years. He had raided across the entire known world, from England to the shores of what the Arabs called Al-Andalus, from Novgorod to Constantinople. His body was a map of his campaigns, marked with wounds from enemies he had defeated. The rage, Ragnar told me when I was 14 years old, is not madness. Many people mistake it for madness because they do not understand it. But rage is something far more sophisticated. It is a door that opens between the rational mind and the primal forces that live within all men. Most men never open this door. Their entire lives pass and they never experience what it means to be truly alive, truly powerful, truly connected to the forces that created the world. Ragnar taught me the techniques of entering the berserker state. It was not something that happened automatically. It required preparation, concentration, a kind of mental discipline that was paradoxically tied to the loss of normal consciousness. First, Ragnar explained, you must breathe, not normal breathing, but deep, powerful breathing that fills your entire body with energy. You breathe through your belly, not your chest. You feel the air moving through you, and you direct it toward your center, toward the place where the rage lives. He demonstrated this for me, and I watched as his breathing became deeper and more rhythmic. His body seemed to expand with each breath, seeming to grow larger, more powerful. Then, he continued, you must remember every insult you have ever received, every enemy who has defeated you, every moment when you were weak or afraid. You gather these memories and you use them as fuel. You do not try to suppress them. Instead, you amplify them. You let them fill you completely. As Ragnar spoke, I could see changes in him. His face seemed to transform. His eyes became wider, wilder. His breathing became louder. His muscles seemed to tense and bulge beneath his skin. Finally, he said, his voice now taking on a strange quality that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the earth. You surrender. You let go of the part of you that thinks, that questions, that hesitates. You become the rage. You become the weapon. You become an instrument of destruction. At this point, Ragnar seemed to undergo a complete transformation. He was no longer quite human. He was something other, something terrifying. His roar, and I can only describe it as a roar, not a shout or a cry, but a roar, shook the very air around us. I felt fear, but I also felt something else. I felt recognition. I felt that I was looking at what I could become. When Ragnar emerged from the berserker state, it took him several minutes to return to normal consciousness. He breathed heavily, sweat pouring down his face. When his eyes focused on me again, he smiled, a smile that was both warm and cruel. "You felt it, didn't you?" he said. "You felt the power. That is what you must learn to master. That is what makes a true berserker." Part 3. First Blood as a Berserker. I was 16 years old when I entered the berserker state for the first time in actual combat. The occasion was a raid against a settlement in what is now called Norway, a place that had refused to acknowledge Viking dominance. My father led an army of perhaps 200 warriors, including 5 other berserkers. I was the youngest warrior to participate in this raid, but my father insisted on bringing me, saying that it was time for me to become fully initiated into the ways of my people. The settlement was defended by perhaps 150 men, local warriors who had trained together and fought together for years. Under normal circumstances, they might have been able to repel us, but we had something they did not have. We had berserkers. The battle began at dawn, with the defenders launching an initial attack hoping to catch us unprepared. But the Vikings were never unprepared. We formed a shield wall, a formation of overlapping shields that was almost impenetrable. The defenders' first assault broke against our shields like waves against a cliff. Then, something shifted. I felt it happening to me. The breathing that Ragnar had taught me, the gathering of rage, the memory of every slight I had ever felt. My vision changed. Colors seemed brighter and more vivid. Sounds seemed louder, more distinct. Time seemed to slow down. I could see individual warriors moving toward me, and I could predict their movements before they made them. My father had given me a weapon, a large axe called a Francisca, with a head the size of a child's head and a handle made from ash wood. I had trained with this weapon for years, but I had never truly tested it in combat. Now, as the berserker state took hold of me, I lifted the axe and I roared. A roar that seemed to come from somewhere outside of me. A sound that made even the other Vikings pause and look at me with a mixture of respect and fear. I charged forward, and the world became a blur of violence. I remember fragments, a warrior's face appearing before me, full of fear and determination, the weight of my axe as it came down, the terrible sound of bone breaking, a spear thrusting at my ribs, but my reflexes moving faster than thought, my hand intercepting the shaft and snapping it in half. Another warrior and another and another. I was not fighting consciously. I was not thinking about tactics or strategy. I was simply destruction incarnate. I was a force of nature, as unstoppable as a landslide or a flood. The defenders fell before men because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the capacity to truly comprehend what was happening. They were fighting men. I had become something other than a man. When the berserker state finally released me, perhaps 30 minutes later, I found myself standing among the corpses of the defenders, covered in blood. Mostly their blood, though some of it was meown. I had no memory of the specific moments of combat, only a kind of montage of violence and power. My father approached me and he was smiling. 43 men, he said. 43 men fell before you. You have proven yourself, Bjorn. You are a true berserker now. I looked down at my axe, which was stained with blood. I looked at the defenders who lay dead around me, and I felt something that I had never felt before. A sense of purpose, of rightness, of understanding exactly what I was meant to be in this world. I was 17 years old, and I had just killed 43 men in a single battle, and I felt more alive than I had ever felt in my entire life. Part 4. The legends begin. In the years that followed my first berserker battle, I became famous throughout the Norse lands. My reputation grew with each raid, each battle, each impossible feat of strength and violence. Warriors began to gather around me, wanting to learn from me, wanting to be part of my legend. By the time I was 25 years old, I had assembled a crew of perhaps 100 warriors who were loyal to me specifically, not just to the general cause of Viking conquest. I named my ship the Valkyrie's Revenge, and I sailed it across the known world. We raided the coasts off England, attacking monasteries and settlements, accumulating wealth and slaves. We sailed south and attacked Frankish settlements, fighting against warriors who were beginning to adopt the heavy armor that would eventually characterize medieval warfare. We sailed north to the shores of what Isno called Iceland, where we fought against other Vikings in disputes over territory and honor. But my greatest fame came not from these distant raids, but from a single battle that would be remembered in Norse sagas for centuries. It happened when I was 32 years old, at a place called the Battle of Jelling. The king of Denmark, a man named Harald Bluetooth, had decided that he wanted to unite all of Scandinavia under his rule. This was an ambitious goal, perhaps an impossible goal, but Harald was determined. He gathered an army of perhaps 3,000 warriors, an enormous force by Viking standards. His goal was to defeat the various local chieftains and consolidate power. My father, Eric the Red, was one of those local chieftains. He controlled the settlement of Kattegat and had perhaps 200 warriors under his command. It was clear that Eric could not defeat Harald's army in direct combat, but he sent word to me, asking me to bring my warriors to his side. He was hoping that the presence of skilled berserkers might tip the balance. I gathered my warriors and sailed for Kattegat. When I arrived, I found my father looking older than I remembered him, but his eyes still burned with the same fierce intelligence and rage that had always characterized him. He embraced me, and I could feel the strength still in his arms. "Harald Bluetooth has made an error," my father said. "He believes that numbers alone determine victory. He has never fought against true berserkers. We will show him the error of his thinking." The armies met on a plain near Jelling, and the sight was extraordinary. 3,000 warriors arrayed against perhaps 400 of us. My father's warriors, my warriors, and warriors from other local chieftains who had allied with us. From a numerical perspective, we were hopelessly outnumbered. But numbers do not tell the entire story of warfare. As the two armies faced each other, my father and I stood at the front of our forces. My father was 60 years old at this time, an age when most men would have retired from warfare. But he was still a formidable warrior, still capable of entering the berserker state, still commanding respect through sheer presence. "When the battle begins," my father said to me, "I want you to remember something. We are not fighting for territory or gold or even honor. We are fighting for the right to remain free. We are fighting for the right to live according to our own laws, to worship our own gods, to die according to our own code. If we lose this battle, we lose everything." The armies charged toward each other, and the battle was joined. The first moments were chaos, the sound of weapons clashing, the screams of the wounded, the roar of warriors who had given themselves over to the battle fury. Our smaller numbers meant that we were quickly surrounded, pushed back, forced to form tighter and tighter formations. Then my father entered the berserker state. I watched as he seemed to grow, to swell with power Andreage. He waded into the ranks of Harald's army, and warriors fell before him like wheat before Thessyth. His roar seemed to shake the very earth. Men who had been advancing with confidence suddenly found themselves retreating, unable to comprehend the fury that they were facing. Seeing my father's transformation, I too entered the berserker state. I felt the familiar shift in consciousness, the way the world became more vivid and vivid at the same time, the way time seemed to slow while my reflexes seemed to accelerate. I became pure destruction, pure violence, pure fury incarnate. Around us, other berserkers entered their rage states. There were perhaps 10 of us total, and as we entered the berserker state almost simultaneously, the psychological impact on Harald's army was devastating. Warriors who had been advancing with confidence suddenly found themselves face to face with something that defied their understanding of what a human being could be. The battle raged for hours, and eventually, Harald's army began to fall back. They had lost perhaps 1,000 warriors. We had lost perhaps 100. But more importantly, Harald's army had been shattered psychologically. The idea that the local chieftains could mount a serious resistance against him had been shattered. However, Harald was a smart man, and he realized that continuing to fight would only result in more losses and would likely unite the chieftains more firmly against him. Instead, he sued for peace. The agreement that resulted recognized Harald as the king of Denmark, but it also recognized the Lokalkieftens' right to maintain their territories and their own forces. In the aftermath of the Battle of Jelling, my reputation reached new heights. I was now famous throughout all of Scandinavia. Skalds, Norse poets, began composing verses about my exploits. They told of the time I fought 50 men at once and emerged without a scratch. They told of the time I bit through a man's shield in the Berserker state. They told of the time I lifted a man above my head and threw him into a river. Some of these stories were exaggerations. Some of them were pure fabrication. But I did not discourage them, because in the Norse culture, reputation was power. A warrior with a fearsome reputation could accomplish through psychological warfare what he might struggle to accomplish through military force alone. Part 5: The Wisdom of Violence. As I grew older, I began to understand something that many younger warriors never grasp. That true strength is not just about physical power or martial skill. True strength is about understanding. It is about knowing your enemy. It is about comprehending the nature of the forces that you are trying to harness. By the time I was 40 years old, I had killed perhaps 2,000 men. I had participated in more than 100 battles. I had seen warfare on a scale that most men could not imagine. And I had begun to develop a kind of philosophy about violence, about rage, about what it meant to be a berserker. I took on an apprentice, a young man named Leif, who was perhaps 16 years old when he comito me. Leif had the marks of a potential berserker. His father had been killed in battle, and that loss had created a wellspring of rage within him. But potential is not achievement. I had to teach him how to transform that rage into something purposeful. Many warriors believe that the berserker state is something that makes you stronger than you normally are. I told Leif one evening as we sat by a fire, but this is not accurate. The berserker state does not make you stronger. It makes you faster. It makes your reflexes sharper. It makes your perception more acute. But most importantly, it removes the hesitation that normally constrains human action. Leif looked at me with confusion. "Hesitation?" he asked. "Yes," I explained. "Every warrior, no matter how brave, has hesitation built into him. There is a small voice in your mind that says, 'This is dangerous. This might hurt. You might die.' This voice exists as a survival mechanism, keeps you alive, but it also constrains your power. It makes you slower. It makes you less effective in combat. The berserker state removes this hesitation, quiets the voice that counsels caution. This is why a berserker can accomplish what normal warriors cannot. We are not stronger, but we are less constrained. We are more willing to take risks. We are more willing to sacrifice ourselves. And this willingness, this lack of hesitation, is what makes us formidable. But doesn't this make us reckless? Leif asked. Doesn't it make us get killed? Sometimes, I acknowledged. There are berserkers who have died because they took too many risks. There are berserkers who have been driven mad by the constant exposure to the berserker state. The gift of being a berserker is also a curse. But the alternative, to live a constrained life, to never fully explore the depth of human potential, is a worse fate, at least for those of us who are called to this path. I taught Leif not just how to enter the berserker state, but how to navigate the aftermath. Because the berserker state is not something that can be maintained indefinitely. After a period of intense combat, the body and mind become exhausted. You emerge from the rage state and you are vulnerable. You are tired. Your reflexes are slower than normal. It is in these moments that you are most likely to be killed. The key, I told Leif, is to have warriors around you who can protect you while you recover. This is why berserkers traditionally fight in groups. We cannot always be at our most powerful. There are moments when we are vulnerable, and in those moments, we rely on the loyalty and skill of our brothers. Leif absorbed these lessons with an intensity that reminded me of myself at that age. Within 2 years, he had become a true berserker, capable of entering and exiting the rage state with skill and control. Within 5 years, he was one of the most feared warriors in all of Scandinavia. Part 6. The Age of Changes. As I entered my 50s, the world around me was changing. The Viking Age was not yet over, but it was beginning to transform. The settled kingdoms of Europe were becoming more organized, more militaristic. The monasteries and settlements that had been easy targets for Viking raiders were beginning to fortify themselves. Kings and emperors were beginning to create standing armies that could mount sustained resistance against Viking attacks. More importantly, Christianity was spreading through Scandinavia. Young men who would have become fierce warriors devoted to the old gods were now becoming monks devoted to the new god. The culture that had produced berserkers for generations was beginning to shift. I watched this transformation with mixed feelings. I was proud of my heritage, proud of the old ways, proud of the code that had governed Viking society for centuries. But I was also pragmatic enough to understand that the world was changing, and that clinging too desperately to the past was a form of suicide. My father, Eric the Red, died when I was 52 years old. He went peacefully, which is the one thing no warrior truly wants. We always hope to die in battle, to go down fighting, to exit this world with blood on our weapons and a roar on our lips. But Eric died in his bed, surrounded by his family. He was with him in his final moments. "Do not mourn me," he said to me in a weak voice. "Mourning is for those who had wasted lives. Ahave lived fully, fiercely, and exactly as I chose to live. I have no regrets." "What about the new world?" I asked him. "What about the changes happening to our people?" "The new world will have its own warriors," he said. "Not berserkers like us, perhaps. Not warriors who can transform into something other, who can feel the presence of Odin himself in their blood. But there will still be warriors who value honor, who value strength, who value living according to a code rather than according to fear." "Will they remember us?" I asked. "Some will," my father said. "The skalds will sing our songs. The warriors will tell tales of our battles. And somewhere, deep in the hearts of certain men, the code that we lived by will continue to burn. The 'tis as much immortality as any man can ask for." After my father's death, leadership of our settlement passed to me. I was no longer primarily a raider or a warrior for hire. I was now a chieftain with responsibilities to my people, responsibilities to ensure their safety, their prosperity, their well-being. This transition was difficult for me. My entire life had been devoted to the pursuit of warriors and adventure and the ecstasy of the berserker state. Now I was required to spend most of my time dealing with practical matters, ensuring that grain was stored for the winter, that trade agreements were established with neighboring settlements, that justice was administered fairly to my people. But I discovered that there was a kind of honor in this work as well. Protecting your people from starvation was not as glorious as defeating enemies in battle, but it was important work. Ensuring that your settlement prospered and grew was not as exciting as a raid, but it was work that mattered. Part 7. The Last Great Battle. When I was 58 years old, a new threat emerged. A powerful king from what is now Sweden, a man named Ragnar Bloodaxe, had decided that he wanted to expand his dominion and consolidate power over all of Scandinavia. He had assembled an army of perhaps 5,000 warriors, and he was using this army to conquer neighboring territories and bring them under his rule. Ragnar Bloodaxe had heard of me, of course. By this time, my legend had spread so widely that I was almost a mythical figure rather than a real man. He sent envoys to my settlement with an ultimatum: submit to his authority, acknowledge him as your supreme ruler, and provide warriors to support his campaigns, or resist and face destruction. I considered this ultimatum carefully. I was now 58 years old. Most warriors had retired from active warfare by this age. I had a comfortable life, a settled position, a people who depended on me. The pragmatic choice would have been to submit, to live out my remaining years in relative peace. But I had not become a legend by making pragmatic choices. I had become a legend by always choosing to fight when my honor demanded it. And my honor demanded that I resist Ragnar Bloodaxe's ultimatum. I sent word to the other local chieftains, the ones who remembered the old ways, the ones who valued freedom over the stability that comes from submission to a distant king. I gathered an army, perhaps 2,000 warriors, and we marched north to meet Eirik Bloodaxe's forces. The armies met near a place called Stiklestad, and the battle that ensued would be remembered as one of the last great battles of the old Viking Age. It was also, as fate would have it, the last time I would enter the Berserker state. As the two armies approached each other, I could feel the familiar sensations beginning. The gathering of rage, the quickening of my breath, the way the world seemed to slow down and become more vivid. I was 58 years old, and my body was not as quick to enter the Berserker state as it had been in my younger years. But the rage still lived inside me, still burned with undiminished fury. I looked at the warriors around me. Many of them were young men who had heard the tales of my exploits but had never fought alongside me. Others were older warriors who had stood by my side through countless battles. All of them were looking at me, waiting for me to give the signal to charge. I took a deep breath, and I let the rage take me. The transformation was complete and overwhelming. I felt my body swell with power. I felt my consciousness expand beyond the normal boundaries of human awareness. I felt, for perhaps the last time in my life, the presence of Odin himself, the All-Father, using me as an instrument of his will. I roared, and my warriors roared with me. We charged forward toward Eirik Bloodaxe's army, and the violence that ensued was beyond description. Imagine two tsunamis crashing into each other, each trying to overwhelm the other. Imagine the sound of thousands of weapons clashing simultaneously. Imagine the screams of the dying, the roars of warriors, the chaos of bodies moving in organized formations. I fought through the heart of Eirik's army. Warriors fell before me not because they lacked skill or courage, but because they were fighting something that defied normal human capability. I remember fragmentary moments, an arrow striking my shoulder and shattering against my skin instead of penetrating, a sword thrusting at my ribs and me moving faster than thought to avoid it, a warrior attempting to tackle me to the ground and me, without conscious thought, lifting him above my head and throwing him through the air. The battle raged for hours, and when it finally ended, Eirik Bloodaxe's army was broken. They had lost perhaps 1,000 warriors. We had lost perhaps 400. But more importantly, Eirik's psychological confidence had been shattered. He had come to Stiklestad believing that his superior numbers would guarantee victory. Instead, he had discovered that numbers do not determine the outcome of battle when one side has warriors who can transform into something beyond human. Eirik Bloodaxe sued for peace. The agreement recognized his authority over some territories, but it also recognized the independence of the local chieftains, including myself. We had won our freedom through force of arms, through the willingness to fight even when the odds were against us, through the power of warriors who valued honor above safety. Part 8: The Fading Flame. When I emerged from the Berserker state after the Battle of Stiklestad, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt old. My body was covered with new wounds. My strength seemed diminished. The rage that had always been a renewable source of power seemed depleted, as if I had drawn upon it so heavily that it needed time to replenish itself. More profoundly, I felt that something had ended. The Battle of Stiklestad was the last great battle of the old Viking Age. Within the next few decades, Christianity would fully penetrate Scandinavia. The old gods would fade into mythology. The code that had governed Berserker warriors for generations would disappear, preserved only in stories and sagas. I was not sad about this exactly. Sadness implies a longing for things to remain as they were, and I have never been a man who longed for the past. But I was aware that an era was ending, and that I was one of the last true representatives of that era. After the Battle of Stiklestad, I continued to serve as chieftain of my settlement for another 15 years. I trained younger warriors in the ways of the Berserker, though I knew that their training would become increasingly irrelevant as the world changed around us. I participated in some smaller raids, though never again with the intensity and fury of my younger days. I watched as my apprentice Leif grew to manhood and took on apprentices of his own. I watched as my children, I had fathered 5 children across my life, grew up and began families of their own. I watched as my settlement grew and prospered, building new longhouses, establishing new trade routes, gradually transforming from a warrior culture to a more balanced civilization. And I waited for death, not with fear but with a kind of patient acceptance. I had lived a life that was full and fierce and exactly according to my own design. I had experienced things that most men could never experience. I had felt the presence of the gods themselves flowing through my body. I had defeated enemies and conquered territories and created a legend that would outlive me by centuries. Part 9, The Reflection. Now, at 67 years old, I spend most of my time by the fire, telling stories to the younger generation. They gather around me in the evening, and they ask me questions about my battles, about the Berserker state, about what it felt like to be so completely transformed by rage. I tell them that the rage is not something to be feared or ashamed of. I tell them that it is a gift, a connection to forces larger than themselves, a temporary transcendence of the limitations that normally constrain human beings. I tell them that the Berserker state is sacred, that it is a form of spiritual experience, and that it requires respect and discipline. But I also tell them the cost. I tell them about the warriors who became addicted to the Berserker state and entered it constantly, gradually losing their sanity, becoming shells of themselves. I tell them about the battles where I emerged from the rage state only to find that most of my warriors had been killed, while I was lost in my own fury. I tell them about the scars, the permanent injuries, the damage that a lifetime of warfare inflicts on a body. Is it worth it? The young warriors always ask, and I consider the question carefully before answering. Yes, I say finally, it is worth it, because the alternative, to live a life constrained by fear, to never experience the full depths of human potential, to never stand face to face with the gods themselves, that would be a worse fate. A man who has felt what I have felt, who has experienced what I have experienced, cannot go back to ordinary existence. To do so would be to live half a life, and half a leaf eyes worse than death. One evening, one of the younger warriors, a boy who reminds me of myself at that age with fire burning in his eyes, asked me a question I had never been asked before. "Chieftain," he said, "now that you are old, now that you cannot enter the Berserker state as you once did, do you regret it? Do you wish you could go back and live a normal life, safe and comfortable?" I considered this question for a long time before answering. I looked at my scarred hands, my missing eye, my body that bore the marks of 55 years of continuous warfare. "No," I said finally, "I do not regret it, not for a single moment. Yes, I am old. Yes, my body is broken and scarred. Yes, the Berserker state does not come to me as easily as it once did. But I have lived, truly lived. I have stood at the edge of the abyss and I have looked into infinity. I have felt the presence of the All-Father himself. I have created a legend that will outlive me by centuries. A man who has experienced what I have experienced cannot wish for a different life. Such a wish would be a betrayal of everything that I am, everything that I have become. So no, I do not regret it. If I had to choose again, I would make the same choices. I would become a berserker. I would embrace their rage. I would live with absolute intensity and complete freedom until the moment of my death.